get out because I said want to go and plant my potatoes. We are recording the meeting so that we can share it later on. So if you are not happy with that, please leave the meeting. But we do want to share it with as many people as possible. And we have had people who haven't been able to attend today who have asked for a recording. So I hope everyone's happy with that. We've got with us today Grant Davis from Wiltshire Council, who is going to talk about finance. Some of you may have heard him present the other day at the governor's briefing. He's got more for us today, so pay lots of attention to that, and he will give us some slides which we can share later, so you don't need to make notes all the way through. After that, we'll have Helen Baker will talk about the Ofsted inspection at Frogwell, and then Cyril, who had an Ofsted inspection at St Augustine, so you'll get a primary and a secondary perspective on very recent Ofsted inspections. And we also have Steve Wigley with us, who has lots of experience on both sides of Ofsted, and he will answer questions at the end. So hopefully we've got quite a lot to get through, and it will be very informative. Just to let you know, these meetings are the ones that used to be branded the chairs networks. We used to meet at the Corn Exchange. We want to broaden it out so all governors can attend, and we are hoping to meet again at the Corn Exchange on the 9th of July. So with any luck, Omicron will be a distant memory, and we'll be very used to COVID, and it will be nothing more than cold by then. So what we'd like to do is we think we want to talk about wellbeing, possibly something else. We've not pinned it down yet. So during the course of the meeting, ping any comments you'd like to in the chat for anything you'd like to hear at our next meeting. And David is also going to share his email address and my email address. And Helen, you can have a cake if it's your birthday on the 9th of July. So that's it. So just a quick reminder to mute yourself if you're not speaking, just so we don't get too much leakage from other people's houses. You probably heard my dog scratching just then. And I'll hand over to Grant, who will kick off.
Okay, Kirsty, thank you very much. And morning, everyone. And well, welcome to the Governors session this morning. It's always a pleasure to come and talk to the Wiltshire Governors Association. So it's really great for me to come and see you all today. And I've got quite a few slides to run through today, so we are going to go at quite a pace. So seatbelts on and hard hats on, as it were, for what we're going to cover today. If there are any questions, please do raise the questions. If you're thinking something or don't understand something, the chances are some of your colleagues will be in exactly the same boat as well. So what I'm going to do is hopefully got the PowerPoint up. You can see the PowerPoint. If somebody could just nod their head, say it's up there, if it is.
Yes, it is.
Yep, brilliant. Smash it.
We're getting feedback from somebody who's not muted.
Okay. Ooh, that sounds a bit better, I think, doesn't it? Yeah, brilliant. Okie dokie. Well, let's crack straight on. So we've got quite a packed agenda today. So what we're thinking of going through is very similar to what we covered off last year, which I think went down really well in terms of what we had for colleagues from the Governors Association. So a bit of statistics, a little bit about Schools Forum, about the funding that's coming in, a bit on high need, budget planning for next year, which is obviously very topical at the moment, and some other areas that we'll just run through around COVID, school improvement, SFVS, and also an update on teachers' pay. Some of you may have heard that at the governor's briefing that we had this week, but I do want to just run through that with everyone. So in terms of what I've got to run through this morning, some statistics just to start us off. So I think it'll be quite useful if I could just show you the movement in terms of pupil numbers across the county. So what we can see is the numbers of pupils in our schools across the last few years. I've gone from 2018-19 up to the current year we're in at the moment. We can see there's a small uplift between 21-22 and the current year of 290 pupils, but we've seen a slight dip in primary pupils, a dip of 297, but an increase in secondary. So that shows the demographic shift that's going on across the county, and that is something that we have been anticipating due to a slightly falling birth rate. So I thought it'd be useful just to share with you the birth rate data, and the birth rate data has been collected by our colleagues in the NHS, and we can see across the last sort of almost 10 years that we were having birth rates of well over 5,000 births per annum, and we can see that dropping down now to 4,500-ish. So we have seen that dip in there, and that is going to have a knock-on impact for pupils moving into schools in due course. And you can see the blue line there just showing that slight drop. Is it something we need to worry about? Well, I suppose it potentially could be longer term. The local authority is aware of it and is undertaking sort of place planning strategy to make sure we have got a school place where we should do. But on some of the future slides I'll go through, we might well see that trend turns a little bit. But it's just useful to share with you what's happening in terms of the birth rate data. So how many schools have we got in Wiltshire? Well, we've got 202 primary schools, 29 secondaries and 4 special schools. The last new schools that opened in Wiltshire were actually back in 2019, so a few years ago now. That was one called Wellington Eagle, which is down in Tidworth, and Kingsgate in Amesbury. And Wiltshire doesn't have a policy of closing schools. That is not something that we're pursuing at all. The last maintained school that closed was Lippiat Primary School, which is a school behind the wire, as it were, on a specific MOD base, and the pupils just literally weren't coming to that school anymore. It was all tied up with the army rebasing and the army moving back from Germany, so there just weren't the pupils for that school. And the UTC in Salisbury that ceased and closed back in August 2020. Can you hear me all right? Is that okay? Yep. Okay, and then we've got the special school reorganisation going on, which is where we've got created the new Silverwood School, and that was Roudford, St Nicholas and Larkrise that came together. So 3 of the former special schools across the county came together to create Silverwood School. So that's just a quick run through of some of the school movements. And then of our Wiltshire schools, we've got 117 maintained primary schools, 4 maintained secondary schools, 85 primary academies and 25 secondary academies. So what you can see is the majority of our secondaries have converted to academies, but within the primary sector is still very much split there, slightly more maintained than there are academies. And with our special schools, we know there's 4 across the county. There's 2 maintained and 2 academy special schools. And there is a new free special school in the south of the county being built. It's going to be called Sale. So that's what it's going to be called. And it's going to be in the former UTC building in Salisbury, which for many of you who know the area is actually the old police headquarters down in Salisbury. We're also having a new building, purpose-built building being built for Silverwood. So the Silverwood campus at Roud, so the Roudford site, as it were, we're having a brand new school built in there, purpose-built special school. It's going to be absolutely fantastic. I don't think they've quite cut the first turf yet, but it will be starting very, very soon. And then we've got our resource base across the county. We've got 18 schools with resource bases and 27 of our secondary schools with ELP provision. Those are for enhanced learning provision for secondary age pupils. So areas of growth, I just wanted to touch on the growth for you. So current expansion projects across the county in primary. We're looking at expansions at Bitham Brook, Lee and Garston, near Malmesbury, Mere Primary School and Holt Primary School. And there's no new schools opening this year as such. But based on the housing developments which are taking place across the county, and most of you will drive around the county and see there's huge developments going on all over, looking at potential new schools or new school developments or enhancing existing schools. So there's the Ashton Park in Trowbridge, the housing development going on, Pathfinder Way in Melksham. In Warminster, we call it the West Warminster expansion. For those of you in the Chippenham area, there's Rowden Park, Birds Marsh and Rawlings Green, huge expansion going on. And down in Salisbury around the Netherhampton Road area. So there's huge developments going on, and that's where we're looking at potential expansion and potentially new schools in those areas too. Looking now at our secondary schools, we can see there's, I suppose the line is fairly flat, but there's a gradual expansion in terms of or increase in pupil numbers across our secondary schools, which we've been anticipating as the numbers through primary has been increasing. Oh, so what does that mean? So in order to manage that demand, we're still having to undertake some expansions and projects around secondary places. And by 2024, our colleagues in the place planning team are expecting we're going to have some increase in secondary provision in the Warminster area, in the Chippenham area and in the Marlborough area. And we're also likely to see some extras in Salisbury and Trowbridge to meet demand as we move forward. So not immediately, but going forward. So there will be expansion of some of our secondaries there too. So in terms of the local planner, and some of you be interested in these numbers, I mean, we can see development going on all around the county, but the next phase of housing takes us up until 2036 in terms of our local planning. And there's going to be a huge impact from there on our decision making around school places and place planning. And there is housing taking place in rural communities too. So it's not just the major sort of towns across the county. There is in our rural communities as well, and that will support rural schools going forwards. But just to touch on some of the major developments we know going on, the proposal for 5,100 homes in Chippenham, 2,500 homes in Melksham, just under 1,000 in Wootton Bassett, another 1,800 in Trowbridge, and another 940 in Salisbury. So there is huge development still to take place around our county, and that will impact upon our schools around the county as well. And it's hard to project when those developments are actually going to be taking place and when the developers are going to start building those homes and things. But as I drive around the county, like many of you do, I'm sure you see development going on all over. So we will have to make sure that our place planning team keep ahead of the game, as it were. Just quickly, I wanted to run through the role of Schools Forum. Schools Forum is the decision-making body for all financial decisions we have in our schools, and it comprises members of our primary and secondary schools, our special schools, our governor community, also from the early years settings, also academies as well as maintained schools. So we've got a broad mix across our Schools Forum, and their role really is to ensure governance around the school funding arrangements for next year. They meet up during the course of the year. We've a minimum of 4 meetings a year to discuss budgets and how things are being taken forward and funding for our schools, as well as undertaking consultation as well. And I've put a link on the slide here when it comes to the School Forum papers, which you might find interesting and useful going forwards. So talking about the school funding framework, how does it all come together? And I'm going to fly through this fairly quickly because I know most of you are fairly familiar with how the overall funding for local authorities and schools works, but we get something called the dedicated schools grant. That's what we receive into the local authority, and that comes to us in 4 individual blocks, and each block has a formula that creates the amount of funding we receive. So we've got a schools block, a central services block, high needs block, and an early years block. And on top of that, there's post-16 funding through a different arrangement that comes through to all of our secondaries with sixth form. And then on top of that, also you'll be familiar with things such as pupil premium that targets funding specifically at vulnerable pupils. So those are the 4 blocks that we receive into the local authority. And what do they all fund? So the schools block funds all of our mainstream schools. So that's all the mainstream school funding comes through that schools block. That's the biggest block. Then we have the central block, which provides for services that we provide to all schools, both maintained and academy schools, such as the admissions service, strategic property planning, and given what we've just been looking at in terms of the local plans and the number of houses to be built, they've got a huge role to play going forwards in there. So they're funded from that central block. We've got the high needs block, which funds our special schools, our resource bases, our help provision in secondaries, and all of our SEND support teams as well. And then we've got the early years block for our nurseries, so that's funding our 2-year-olds and 3- and 4-year-olds elements of funding in there. And like I said, each block's got a different formula for how we receive the funding into Wiltshire. And then what we agree through Schools Forum is any potential transfer of funding between the blocks. And Schools Forum have agreed to transfer some funding from the schools block to help the high needs block, where we're seeing huge growth demands in there. And for the ensuing year, 22-23, 0.5% of funding has been transferred, which is about £1.6 million. So in terms of what does that money look like in terms of real figures, it's breathtaking really when you see those amounts there. So for next year, the amount of funding we'll be receiving into Wiltshire to fund all of our schools and all the high needs early year will be 422 million. You can see the biggest chunk, like we said, is the schools block. Very small amount in the central block for those centrally provided services. And then we've got our high needs block, which is 62 million in there, and then we've got our early years block underneath. So that's the total funding we receive into Wiltshire. And I just thought it might be useful to give you a comparison over back in 2019-20, the funding in there was 275 million for the schools block. It's now at 328 million, so a huge increase over that period. And I suppose we know collectively as the Boris Billions years, which has taken us through from 2021 all the way through to next year. And we have seen that funding pledge come through. And just interesting to see the extra funding between the current year we're in at the moment and next year, an increase in the schools block of 10 million in there, and an increase of nearly 5 million in the high needs block. So those are quite significant increases. So that's been really positive news. For next year, what we can see of that funding pledge of £14 billion, we can see the 7.1 billion coming extra into the block. It's not cumulative, sorry, it's not in an extra 7.1 as such, as if that builds on the previous year. So it's an extra 2.3 billion really coming in terms of extra. But it's really good news to see that funding coming in. We all remember the very harsh years when there was flat cash in terms of any increases of funding coming into schools. So this is really positive news. So what that means is that we're seeing an uplift for next year in your pupil-led factors and your school-led funding factors of 3%. So we'll see all that going through in your per pupil funding, the lump sum that your schools receive, prior attainment, English and additional language funding, and your deprivation funding. But some of the other factors don't necessarily get that uplift, such as the PFI costs, rent, sparsity, and so on and so forth. But I'll cover those in a little bit more detail in a moment. In the Chancellor's spending review, so the comprehensive spending review took place in the autumn. This is some really good news going forward. We know the Boris Billions years takes us to the end of next financial year, but there was an additional 4.7 billion put in for core funding beyond that. So we know between 23-24 and 24-25, those next 2 years, there's going to be additional funding coming in, and we think that's going to equate to roughly a 2% uplift in your core funding for schools. That's really positive news. And it also includes an extra billion for recovery premium across the next 2 years. So we're seeing the recovery premium that schools have received to help with COVID going on for an additional 2 years. So that's really good news. The primary rates are going to continue at £145, but they're looking to uplift the secondary rates, nearly doubling them is the word we've heard on the street. So that should be really good news. And also some extra funding to help create extra high needs places, which we most welcome up and down the country. So in terms of getting budgets out to schools and funding for our schools, what we know is that the funding that we're awarding out to schools is based upon the national funding formula, and that's an agreement that Schools Forum came to. They wanted to mirror pretty much the funding principles behind the national formula. So we all know that in the long run, the DfE will be funding all schools centrally, and they're going to have a national formula in place, and they already tell us what those national formula rates are. So Wiltshire is really keen to mirror that so that there's no huge differentials when that national formula does come into place. As is always the way, our council cabinet have to agree the funding formula for 22-23 based upon all the decisions made by Schools Forum, and they will obviously work on the decisions that come through from Schools Forum and approve that formula. And they agreed the transfer of 1.6 million, which Schools Forum had proposed. So the budgets all came out to schools by the 28th of February, which is good news. So all of your schools know that the funding you're due to receive for the ensuing year, which is great. For maintained schools, we ask that you get your budget information into us by the 17th of June. And for academies, your deadline is the 26th of July to get those directly into the DfE themselves. So the key factors, I'm going to fly through these this morning because we've got a packed agenda, but you'll all know that the main factors comprising the national formula for the pupil-led factors, there's the ORPU, that's the per pupil funding that you receive, that went up by 3%. There's something in there called the minimum per pupil funding level, and I'll come on to that in a moment. There's deprivation funding, that's for pupils that are eligible for a free school meal, so your school receives funding towards providing for a free school meal for those pupils, and you also receive something called EVER6 funding, which is deprivation funding to help put provision in place in your school. And there's also something called the Adachi Index, which is the index of deprivation affecting children. It's an index to help with deprivation costs in your school. It's a bit of a postcode lottery. They divide the whole country up into postcode areas and determine which ones are deemed to be more of a deprivation postcode area, and pupils that come from those postcode areas do draw extra funding into your schools. Prior attainment funding, and that's based on the early years foundation stage profile and the key stage 2 progress. But of course, because we haven't been doing tests in schools due to COVID, they're having to use historic data to fund our schools at the moment. So hopefully that will revert to using current data when we can get the test and things back in schools properly, post-COVID as it were. English as an additional language, and again, we fund for all pupils for their first 3 years in state education. So that's really positive news for those pupils that where English isn't their mother tongue. And then for mobility, this was a new factor that came in the 21-22 in the current year, and that's basically funding that schools receive where pupils start at those schools at what they call a non-standard entry point. So they don't start school in September, they may start at another point during the course of the year, and they're registered for the first time on either the spring census or the May census. And where schools have got a proportion of their schools of pupils in their schools that have started at a different entry point rather than at the 1st September, if that's above 6% of their school population, the school receives extra funding. The main sort of recipients of that tend to be our service schools, where you can imagine there is a higher sort of turnover of pupils and things, and pupils joining at different points during the year. Then we've got the school-led funding factor. So lump sum, that's a flat rate for all of our schools. That's the same whether you're the smallest school in the county or the biggest school in the county. Sparsity funding, and I'll come on to this on the next slide, to support our small rural schools. Business rates. Just to quickly note, business rates will be centrally funded by the DfE next year. So that means for all of our academy schools, you currently pay your business rates to the local authority and then recover the money from the DfE. You won't need to do that going forwards. That will all be done centrally by the DfE for you. So that's good news. PFI schools that we fund on a historic basis for the PFI costs. Schools with a split site. So this is where a school is over 2 sites and they're more than half a mile apart by road. Then we recognise the fact that some of the schools will have extra costs where they've got that split site. So having to have, for example, 2 receptionists, 2 photocopiers, two lots of broadband band lines and so on and so forth. So there's extra funding there. Exceptional premises. This is for those schools that don't have their own hall to have their assemblies in, or don't have a playing field to do their PE and things on and have to hire those. And then growth. So this is where we're looking to grow our schools. So schools that are seeing an increase in their PAN, and we're putting new buildings onto schools and things. And there'll be quite a lot of growth going on as we move forwards based upon those build out rates around some of our towns in Wiltshire going forward. So those are the key funding factors that we're looking at. So what were the key changes? Well, the sparsity funding is probably what I would describe as the key change. And sparsity is there to support our small rural schools. So that's primary schools of less than 150 pupils, secondaries with less than 600 pupils. And a sparsity distance is calculated. And that distance is calculated as being the average distance a pupil would have to travel to get to their next nearest school. So for example, if your school were to close, what's the average distance a pupil would have to travel to get to their next nearest school? And that's deemed to be the sparsity distance. And the DfE used to measure it as the crow flies, and they've now moved to measuring it by road distances, because let's face it, pupils do travel to school by road, not on the back of crows. So that's appropriate. But the DfE have recognised the issues with funding for small schools, and they've increased the sparsity funding, the maximum the schools can receive, to 55,000 in primary and 80,000 in secondary. And they've also done a tapering exercise for those distance thresholds. So it was 2 miles, the average sparsity distance had to be in primary, and 3 miles in secondary. And what they've said is they need to recognise the fact that some schools literally just miss out on that funding. And so they've tapered the funding that schools can receive. So if you're a primary and you have a sparsity distance of 1.6 miles, then you can now receive funding, but it will be reduced on a straight line basis. So that's brought an awful lot more of our schools into scope for receiving funding. And again, based upon the size of the school as well, the sparsity calculation does like a weighting in there. So the smaller the school, the more the funding that is received. So the schools forum agreed that this was going to be the national formula methodology, and I put that into place. And what we've seen for the 22-23 year is that more schools will receive that funding. It's almost double the number of schools. About 66 schools will receive sparsity funding next year, which is really positive news for supporting those schools in those rural communities. So we talked about the 14 billion pledge, the Boris Billions years as it were. So what does that actually mean? Well, in terms of the minimum per pupil funding level, that's taking all of the funding that we receive into your school divided by the number of pupils. The minimum amount your school must receive has moved up. So in secondary, it was at 4,800 4 years ago. It's now at £5,525. And for primaries, that's moved from 3,500 to 4,265. You can see that just is a huge increase, and that's the effect that the extra funding pledges has pushed through. But I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about how that minimum per pupil funding level is calculated. And I've just used a very basic school example here, one elementary primary school based on 210 pupils. We can see this is the funding the school would receive. So 210 pupils in the school, some pupils eligible for free school meal and free school over 6. And they're on the Hidachi postcode data, some of them are receiving, drawing extra funding into the schools. And we can see when we go through all of this particular school receives 878,000, divided by the 210 pupils on roll, and we can see that's £4,182 altogether on there. What that means, though, is that school is receiving funding below the minimum per pupil funding level, which is £4,265. So therefore, they need to be topped up to make sure the overall school is funded at £895,000, which means they need a top up of £17,340. That's how it works. It basically says take all your funding, divide by the number on roll, and you must be funded at £4,265. And we take account of that in preparing all of your school budgets. Just to give you an example of a school where they wouldn't receive that funding, similar one form entry school, but with slightly different pupil characteristics in there. And we can see in this case, this particular school funding certificate says they're getting 926,000. When you divide that through by the 210 pupils on roll, they're funded at 4,400, which is more than the minimum per pupil funding level. So they don't get an uplift. And that particular concept has been in place now, and it's a mandatory factor we have to apply as part of the funding formula for all of our schools to make sure you're funded at those levels. Okay, so we know that the funding formula for 22-23 is broadly very similar to the previous years, and that we're following the national formula values. We've seen that uplift in school and pupil-led funding facts of 3%. We know there's those changes to the sparsity funding, which is helping our small and rural schools across the county. And we've got those uplifts in the minimum per pupil funding levels. And the only one I just want to touch on again is that business rate. So for all of our schools, your business rates will be paid for centrally by the DFE now. So there will be no cash transactions as such through your schools as such. It'll all be dealt with by the DFE. So that's really positive news. Just very quickly going to talk about some high needs. So all of our schools in Wiltshire have pupils with some form of special educational needs or education healthcare plan in the school, and that will attract extra funding into your school. And we all know that if you've got pupils with SEN in your school, that requires a commitment from the whole school. So not just the SENCOs and the head teachers and the class teachers, but also all the other staff in the school, such as your business managers, your catering staff, your housekeeping staff, and so on and so forth. And we know that we've got an uplift nationally in the high needs funding that's going through for next year. So Wiltshire shares an extra 5 million, as we saw earlier. And is that good news? Well, it is good news in terms of extra funding coming through. Does it provide us with a sustainable solution? No, actually, Wiltshire is currently overspending against its high needs budget quite significantly. And by the end of this current financial year, we're expecting a cumulative deficit of about £28 million. And that isn't through wanton misspending and reckless spending by the local authority. That's just reflecting the demand for high needs places and high needs funding support throughout the counties. The demand is outstripping the uplift in income. And it's a real issue that our colleagues in schools forum are having to work through. So for next year, our allocation is around 62 million. What will it fund? Well, it funds the special schools, the resource-based places and top-ups, the ELP places in secondary schools and top-ups, named pupil allowances, and all of our schools across the county have got pupils with a named pupil allowance. That's a pupil that's got an education healthcare plan that delivers some additional funding to support that pupil in your school. And we know that it also funds some of our SEN teams at the local authority. But just to let you know, we've got those 6 locations for special schools around the county. We've got 867 places. We've got 339 places in our resource bases and 290 places in our ELP provision in secondary. So with our named pupil allowance, and all schools will have a pupil with a named pupil allowance, the funding comes to the school, not to the parents. So it does come to the school. And most of those pupils are in our mainstream school settings. And the school will receive the normal per pupil funding. So that's the ORPU and deprivation and prior attainment type elements of funding. And then this top up that's paid for the MPA. And those rates that you receive with the MPA, they're consistent across all of our funding rates we put in place for high needs funding. So just to give you an example, here we are, we're talking about a resource base in this case. So a resource base place funding receives £6,000. There's £6,000 for all of our places in our resource base and our ELP provisions. And then there's a top up that comes along on top of that. And the bands are set out on the slide there. You can see what the individual bands are. So if we had a pupil, for example, in a resource base who's on the upper one banding here, what the school would receive is they'd receive the upper one banding for the pupil 4,067 plus the £6,000 worth of place funding gives £10,067. If the pupil was an MPA pupil, so they're not in a resource space or an out provision, the school wouldn't receive the £6,000 place funding. They would just be receiving the top up funding as in the table there. So who is administering high needs? Well, it's all done by the local authority and will continue to do so in future years. So even if the DfE start to fund all schools centrally, high needs will still be dealt with at a local level. It's the only way it can be managed. And the funding rates that we put in place to fund our schools are agreed by schools forum each year, and they have to take account of some very significant cost pressures within the high needs block. I just mentioned the huge cumulative deficit we've got in that situation. The feedback from the working groups that we've got high needs working groups and an SEM working group, and also representations from schools as well. And what happens in terms of our funding when we pay monies out schools, we do issue with a schedule every month if you've got a resource space or an out provision, or if you've got named pupil allowance pupils in your school, you receive one termly. And those schedules come out detailing how much funding you'll receive into your school. And it's really important to check those every month, because if there's any errors or omissions, then we could be underfunding you, or conversely overfunding you for pupils left. Just very quickly, I want to touch on notional SEN, and I'm not going to make a big meal out of this, but notional SEN funding is probably the most confusing area of school funding. And what it is, notional SEN funding is the amount of money within your core school budget that's identified to help with the SEN costs of pupils in your school. So it's not extra funding, it's contained within the formula factors that you receive into your school, and your school is expected to provide for the first £6,000 worth of funding for every pupil with SEN in your school. So on your funding certificate or your GAG statement, depending whether you're an academy or a maintained school, will be a box a bit like this that breaks down how your notional SEN funding is calculated. And it comprises part of the basic ORPU funding, part of the deprivation funding, and part of the prior attainment funding. And you can see in this particular example, a school's total funding they receive, 234,000 is deemed to be their notional SEN. And so what the guidance says from the DfE is that all schools are expected to use their notional SEN budget to meet the needs of those pupils with high incidence SEN in their schools. And this is DfE guidance, not Wiltshire guidance, it is DfE guidance. It states that all schools are expected to fund the first £6,000 worth of high needs provision for pupils with SEN. And I know in reality that some pupils need a lot more than that and some pupils will need less than that. But all pupils who have an education healthcare plan will receive a top up on top of that. So that's available through the named pupil allowance. So in our schools expect to fund the first £6,000 worth of any high needs provision, and then there'll be a top up if your pupil has an education healthcare plan as well. So quick breather, right, we've been through quite a lot already. What we're going to look at now, we're going to look at budget planning. So between February and June, that's the key budget planning sort of time of year. And what we know is there's all sorts of sources of income coming into your school. So you've just had your funding certificates or your GAG statements. You'll also have pupil premium coming into your schools. There'll be high needs income coming in through the MPA and any top-ups if you've got resource space. There's growth funding if your school's expanding. Other government grants to come in. So in primaries, we've got the Universal Infant Free School Meal Grant, the PE grant, and we don't know at the moment whether the PE grant will continue to the next academic year or not. The DfE haven't told us yet, and they probably won't tell us till June based on how they normally tell us. So we won't know that for a while yet. The Teachers' Pay and Pension Grant, that is ceasing. I've left that in there because some of our sixth forms will still be receiving that, certainly to the end of this academic year. COVID-19 funding, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, and then other income that your school may draw on, which is from lettings. I put bank interest there, but there's not a lot of interest these days. Donations, contributions from your breakfast and after school clubs, and then we've got capital funding as well. And some of our schools are in the lucky position, in fact most of you are, that you've got balances to bring forward positive balances, which is bringing forward your rollover revenue surpluses. So a few income updates. So we're going to go quickly through the supplementary grant, the pupil premium, the PE grant. I've just said to you, we're waiting confirmation about that for the next academic year, and the DfE are so slow at letting us know when that's going to come through. Last year, it was July when we found out for definite it was coming through. Universal Infant Free School Meal Grant, that is continuing into next year. So that's for all of our infant pupils in primary. COVID income I'll touch on. And then we've already mentioned about that assumption of a 2% income uplift beyond next financial year based upon that funding pledge that came through from the comprehensive spending review. So most of you will have seen this, this slide before, but just go back to it. Sorry. Supplementary funding for 22-23. So this was announced by the Chancellor as part of that spending review. For 22-23, this is going to come to your schools as a supplementary grant, okay? Not included in your GAG statement or your funding certificate. And so it's not included in the Access Budget software for the maintained schools for 22-23. You will need to calculate it yourselves. But the table there sets out the funding rate. So if your school's got a maintained nursery, you get £24 a pupil. Primary, it's £97 a pupil. And then for secondaries, depending on Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4, £137, £155. And for all post-16 learners, £35. Then based upon your number of free school meal ever 6 pupils, £85 in primary, £124 in secondary. And regardless the size of your school, there's a flat lump sum uplift of £3,680. For the 23-24 year, those values will be baselined into your funding factors for the 23-24 year count off. It's just for the 22-23 year. This announcement came out after the DfE had already proposed all their funding rates, so it has to be built as a supplementary grant for next year. Okay. And I've just put on the table there just some example size schools so that you can see roughly how much income could be coming through to individual schools. These are based on real information. So a small primary could see an uplift of 9,000 and one of our largest secondary schools with a sixth form, 226,000. All based upon the October 21 census. So that's the census that's driven all of your core school funding as well. And it'll be paid from April next month for academy schools as well as maintained schools. So it's not reliant on being funded on the academic year for academy schools. It will come to you from April. And what's it for? Well, it's to cover the extra national insurance costs. That's the 1.25% uplift for the health and social care levy and other costs your schools are seeing, such as energy costs, your inflationary pressures, your pay awards, which we'll touch on in a moment. And it is just core school income, no ring fencing of this grant at all. Just very quickly to let you know about pupil premium, that pupil premium rates are increasing for next year, and I've put the amounts in red there on the slide so you can see they've slightly uplifted, which is positive news for schools. And then quickly touching on the recovery premium grant. So this is one of the COVID grants. The recovery premium grant came in for the current academic year, the 21-22 year. It will be continuing for 2 more academic years. And we heard that from the DfE themselves. They did a presentation, said it will continue. £145 for each eligible pupil in mainstream schools and £290 for eligible pupils in special schools. But they did comment that they are looking to almost double the amount going into secondary. So that's really positive news. And your schools are already receiving that funding, but it will continue for 2 further academic years. And then there's a school-led tutoring COVID grant as well. And you'll recall that this was a grant that came out and there was a lot of upset about it, I think, in how the provision would be delivered in schools. But basically, it's based upon 60% of your pupil premium pupils, and you're funded at £13.50 an hour in mainstream schools, £35.25 in special schools. And the idea is that that subsidy will cover 75% of the cost of any tutoring you put in place, and the school has to fund the other 25%. This grant will continue for 2 more years, and it's going to drop that subsidy rate down to 60% next academic year and then to 25% the year after. So we can see at the moment the school's funded the subsidy rate of 75%, so the school has to find that 25%. It is a ring-fence grant and it can be repaid back to DfE if your school doesn't use it. But the idea was that you could use familiar teachers and TAs and former teachers and so on to deliver extra tutoring to pupils in your schools. And it can be used for backfill of existing staff as well. I just put the link onto the National Tutoring website on there. It's not been the most popular of COVID grants, that one, because of the way that the provision has to be delivered and also the way it's funded too. Okay, very quickly, we're going to have a fly through some of the expenditure costs. You know, the main expenditure costs to your schools are all around payroll. And there's various elements in there we'll touch on in a moment. Premises and grounds maintenance, any utilities and capital projects, and utilities are a real worry at the moment. Educational supplies, your admin costs, IT, insurance, catering, right choice services for your school, and also you've got your school development or school improvement plan that you look to fund as well. So in terms of budgets for 22-23, the key budget assumptions I've listed here. We know what the income uplift is for 22-23, but beyond that, there's the 2% uplift in funding, which is based on that government pledge. Teachers' pay award, we have built into the software for maintained schools, and we encourage academies to have done the same as well, was a 3% uplift in teachers' pay award from 22-23 onwards. Support staff pay award, we're building in 2% for each year, and you'll all know that, or probably hopefully just know, that the support staff pay award for the 21-22 year has just been agreed. For the maintained schools, all of your schools will have their support staff having that back pay paid in March. So we know that's now been agreed, which is good news. And I know a lot of our academy schools also mirror the same pay award as well. Other inflation I put in there at 3%. I know some of you will be saying, well, RPI is higher than that, Grant. Why are you only going for 3%? Well, a good proportion of the RPI is based on energy costs, and we're encouraging schools to uplift their energy budgets for next year, or the amount they think they're going to spend. This is based upon the West Mercia energy contract that's in place, which most of our maintained schools have signed up to. I think there's 107 maintained schools signed up to this contract, and they've advised us that electricity costs will be going up by a whopping 53%, and then gas going up by an even, well, more jaw-dropping amount, 108%, on oil by 50%. But after the 22-23, they're saying they should just increase by inflation, but we will have to wait and see. There's obviously other world events going on at the moment that could impact that. Now, you'll all be aware that schools have also, their volume usage will have gone up too, because not only will we see the price go up, but schools have been doing a lot with ventilation, doors open, windows open and things, whilst the heating's on. So there is going to be a significant implication there. For our maintained schools, we've incorporated all of that into the Access Budget software to help with your budget scenario planning, and we encourage our academy schools to make their own decisions, but obviously sharing the information that we'll be using for maintained schools. Just quickly to touch on a consultation that we brought to you during the course of the year, which was regarding the School Improvement Monitoring and Brokering Grant. This is a grant that the local authority receives to support school improvement activities for maintained schools. And our allocation for the current year was 459,000. The DfE consulted on reducing that grant by 50% next year, and then 100% removal the following year. And through some consultations that took place, we did do an open consultation and then 2 dedicated sessions. The results of that consultation were presented to Schools Forum for a view to be taken, and it was agreed by Schools Forum that the maintained schools would de-delegate funding to support school improvement functions. They valued all the school improvement services they were receiving. I have put on there the link to the consultation that came out from the DfE. And it was a very difficult one, but a consultation had to put in place because nobody wants to ask for more money, but the services were valued to the point that, yes, the schools agreed that's what they wanted to happen to continue. There could well have been a loss of funding to help some of our bodies such as Primary Heads Forum, the Secondary Heads Forum, and other local networks in place, as well as the core school improvement service as well. So our school improvement service will be working with schools and consulting with schools about the future direction of how we deliver school improvement for the future off the back of that. Very quickly, just to mention the school's financial value standards. So the SFVS return is a return that all maintained schools have to complete. It's due in by the 31st of March. I'm looking forward to receiving all your returns very, very soon. Basically, it's 30 questions that come out, and it's a self-assessment tool to help your school. So it's delivered by your school, and it's questions that need to be raised by your school. I encourage governors to be as involved as possible in the SFVS process with your school business manager and head teachers. But it's a really good self-assessment tool for finding out a lot of information about your school and where you currently are. And I've put the guidance on the slide there. So that's due in by the 31st of March, bit of a plug for that date. And for our colleagues in the academies, you've got something called the Schools Resource Management Self-Assessment Tool as well. Exactly the same type of document, slightly longer. It's got 42 questions over those 6 areas. And there's also a benchmarking set of information as well that you can use to help inform your return there. But your return is due in by the 15th of March, so very, very soon. So just encouraging you all to get your skates on with that one. Schools year-end close down. So for our maintained schools, yes, the year-end comes to an end at the end of this month, believe it or not. Yes, it'll soon be upon us. Where's that year gone? We're doing a program this year called Countdown to Close Down to try and help our maintained schools by putting some regular messages out through Right Choice, just around things that need to be done in the school to help with that close down process to make it as smooth as possible. It can be onerous in schools when it comes to year end in terms of the amount of work that needs to be done. So we're just going to try and ease you through that process over the coming weeks to make sure that your school presents as accurate a position as possible that can be used for your benefit as well as for the LA's benefit. And I'm encouraging all the schools to make sure you've got your support accountant close down meeting booked in. So keep an eye out for those messages coming through. The first one went out yesterday, and we've got a very catchy looking logo on there. A little bit of a rip off of the Countdown to TV program, but it does look good, and it's just really helpful to put out those bite-sized bits of information for our schools. So I wanted to touch on the Teachers' Pay Award, and those of you that came to the briefing earlier this week, you may have already seen this, but I just want to run through it for everyone here. Now, the Teachers' Pay Award for the next 2 years is really important. And this is a bit of a stop press because the information only came out last Friday. The government have presented to the School Teachers Review Board their proposals for the moving of the starting salary of teachers towards 30,000. And that proposal's been out there for a couple of years now. And this is how they're proposing to get to that point. And there is a link to the guidance on the slides when they come out to you. I've got 2 tables on the screen, and this is just what I wanted to run through with you. So if we could concentrate on the table on the left-hand side to start with, this is the 22-23 pay award for teachers, and teachers' pay award kicks in from the 1st of September each year. The proposal is to move to a starting salary of 30,000, but in the 22-23 year, they want to move to 28,000, and then in 23-24 move up to the 30,000. And this is how they plan to, or propose to do it. So we can see our main scale 1 teachers at the top there. Their current salary banding is 25,714. The move to 28,000 would be an uplift of £2,286, which percentage-wise is 8.9%. So that's what it would be. And you can see the other impact on the bands below there. And when we get down to the upper pay scale bands at the bottom, you can see the proposal is for a 3% pay uplift. So in effect, what that would be doing is almost that accordion squeeze, a compression of the pay band. So what we would see is the differential between the pay bands being reduced. So the individual incremental differences between each pay band would be reduced as a result of this. And if we move to the table on the right-hand side, we could now see the main scale 1 teacher moving from 28,000 up to 30,000, that uplift of £2,000, and you can see the percentage there is 7.1%. And as we move down the percentage uplift, what you can see is the main scale 6 teachers and the upper pay scale teachers seeing an uplift in their pay rates of 2%. So again, confirming that compression of the pay scales going forwards. Now, I know in the software, we've built in a pay uplift of 3% across the board for future years. Of those members of staff that are at the lower end, so the main scale 1, 2s, and 3s and so on, that pay uplift is going to be more than that. And what we'll be doing is we'll be working with your schools to try and work out what impact that will be for your school. So for maintained schools, there would only be, because this would kick in from the 1st September, there'd only be a 7/12 of the year impact in this year. But the software is built in a 3% uplift, and some of these uplifts are beyond that or above that. So therefore, we need to try and work out what that implication would mean for your schools. So we're thinking about creating a little calculator that we can use with your support accountants to see what the impact would be for your schools. Is it something you need to worry about? It's a proposal at this stage, so it hasn't been ratified, but the chances are, because it's a proposal, it's got legs, and I suspect it will come into fruition in due course. So really, it's just to make you aware of that. Will there be another teachers' pay grant to help fund this? No, I don't think there will be. I think the DfE will say you've got your supplementary funding that we looked at earlier. That should cover other costs in your school. So it's there to cover the national insurance uplift, your energy costs, and whatever else comes your way, of which this is one of those costs. So don't expect another teachers' pay grant at the moment. Like I say, it's still proposal at this stage, and we will keep you updated as and when we hear any more details about that one. But it's just one to really be aware of, because this is quite big news. And that's pretty much what I wanted to cover this morning in terms of the session. So I know that's been a very much a whistle-stop tour of the funding and the issues that we've got going on in schools at the moment. I hope it's been useful for you today. And if you've got any questions or queries, please do ask them. I think there's some probably in the chat box at the bottom, and I'll pick those up as well. Unless Kirsty, you want to run through a few of them now. I'm just conscious of the time. Everyone's given up their time this morning to come onto the session. So, and we've got a lot of other speakers as well this morning.
I just want to say thank you so much, Grant, because that's a real canter through and an awful lot to absorb. So for those who joined a little bit later on after Grant had started, we will be circulating all the slides so you can catch up with those later. If you've got a question, please stick your hand up. John Cameron, you mentioned something. Would you like to unmute and ask your question? No.
Sorry, took me a bit of time. Grant, when you talked about electricity, gas, oil prices going up by 50%, I think, for the electricity and oil, is that 50% from our budget for 21-22 or from our expected actual for 21-22, which is still quite hard to work out? It's 50% on what?
I would do it on your budgeted. So your schools are very good at recognizing their energy costs in terms of each year. It's been relatively static, obviously with the inflationary uplifts. What I would say is the price is going up 50%. So whatever the price that you've been paying will go up 50%, plus your usage will have gone up.
But 50% on what, Grant? 50% on what? On last week's number, next week's number? I mean, it's going up pretty quickly in the last
I would say on your
months.
budget. I would put it on your Yeah, and I would do it on your budgeted figure, because the West Mercia energy contract, which most of our schools are signed up to, is fixed for the pricing was fixed for a year. So you would have known that in advance anyway. So you would have budgeted on that basis. So I would put it onto your budgeted figures, but also be aware of your usage going up as well.
I think that's quite optimistic myself, but thank you for your answer. 50% on the budget for this year seems like still quite a modest estimate of potential.
Yeah, so it's 53% for the electricity, 108 on gas, and 50% on oil. So they are huge increase. If you've got local intelligence that's better than that, then obviously use your local intelligence. But if you haven't, there's a guidance there for you. Thank you.
Mark, did you want to ask a question, or is that just a comment that you'd like to leave in the chat box there?
I can ask the question. Yes, very, very quickly, Grant. The delegation costs that you mentioned, the 939 for 22-23 and 1879 for 23-24, presumably the ones for 22-23 are already in the funding certificate already. But are the ones for the following year, which are greater, are they built into the budgeting software automatically?
Yeah, so in terms of the budgeting software, we've built them in for the 22-23 year. The 23-24 year, we've left them at the current rate in it, and the reason for that is, Mark, each year we go to schools forum and do the consultation takes place with all the maintained schools each year, and that result goes to schools forum, and they have to make a decision as to whether or not they want to go with the de-delegation or not. And at the schools forum meeting, it was questioned whether or not members from our schools community wanted to have a greater involvement with how the shape of school improvement would be going forward. So we haven't reflected the £18 into the following year. There's also a request that's gone into the local authority about funding some of that as well. So whether or not the local authority is able to put some money towards the school improvement service as well. So we've left it as it stands at the moment, Mark. So so it hasn't been built in for 23-24 at the higher rate. No, it hasn't.
Okay, so we might, if we were being a little bit prudent, we might think there might be some additional costs, but there's clearly a lot of unknowns, at the moment. Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. It's so tricky. I think if we've got 95% of the cost pretty much right, there's a few where there's a level of uncertainty, and like John was saying, that the energy ones are one which are really causing a bit of an issue as well. So yes, that's really helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And Helen has a question about the energy and how that's bought.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on energy, Helen, and it's about whether or not we future buy. The West Mercia energy contract that most of our maintained schools are signed up to, they do future purchase. Yes, you're absolutely right. And I think they bought something like 80% of the future usage for electricity and gas. So there's only a small proportion, but that small proportion has gone up, astronomically, which is what's caused a bit of an issue going forward. And our colleagues from our energy team that manage it with West Mercia were saying that they expected the energy prices to massively shoot up and then to level out. But with world events being what they are now, I can't help but feel that maybe that's an assumption that we're going to have to revisit. And obviously, we'll keep you posted as normal through Right Choice and through the briefings and things. But there's just a huge level of uncertainty around that whole area at the moment.
I think I was just asking to try and explain that often energy is bought forward. So at the moment, there's a little bit of cushion because it's usually brought forward at least a season, and hence why maybe the recommendation of only 50% onto the budget, because although prices are doubling, 80% of you said is already bought. So the proportion left that's going up isn't as much as people might think for the current couple of seasons. It's just what happens probably summer, winter next year that might not have been forward bought.
Yeah, there is a huge amount of uncertainty, and colleagues in that team are sort of trying to get the best picture they can do for it. Those schools that have oil, and there are quite a number of our rural schools that use oil, will obviously get that from their local supplier and things. And obviously, it's a bit harder to future buy your oil for schools. So that one is based upon the expectation with costs on this. That's why that's in at 50%. Thank you.
Thank you. Has anyone else got any other questions for Grant? Okay, there are none obvious, but I suspect that once people have had another look at the presentation or had time to digest it, there might be some. David's already put my email into the chat. So if people wanted to email me any additional questions, maybe I could gather them up. And I'm rather making some work for you, Grant, but would you be happy to answer some additional questions or some later? So that might be the best way of dealing with it.
That'd be lovely there. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Grant. It's really fascinating and so much information. And I don't know how you contain all that in your head. So thank you. And if you feel you'd like to slope off, you can. Otherwise, stay with us while we move on to the Ofsted section of the meeting.
Okay, thank you, Kirsty.
Okay, thank you. So Ofsted, so we're going to talk first of all with Helen and then with Cyril. And then Steve will join us, well, he's already in the meeting and listening, and we'll answer lots of questions. So Helen, would you like to take the lead now? We can't hear you, Helen, but we can see your presentation.
No, that's fine. When the screen came up, I lost the unmute button. Okay, right. Are you getting the full screen experience yet? Or
no, we're seeing the whole presentation at the moment.
Full screen now?
I'm not seeing the full screen, but I'm laggy, so I'm going to let David chip in there.
No, I can't see the full screen. Yes, that's it now. Well done. Thank you.
I'm sorry, Zoom decided to play. It was a primary school based in Chippenham, and we have in the region of circa 200, 220 children. And if you can hear me, as soon as I've do apologise. Okay, hope you can hear me. So it's not just because Steve is here, but I would absolutely say working with your school improvement advisor is invaluable. We've been lucky enough to have support from Kathy and Steve. And really, they're there to help you. Everything they try and do, all the advice they give is from their vast experience, and they will be just sending you in the right direction. So before your inspection, work with your team as much as possible. As I say, they're absolutely invaluable. I would always say attend as many governor services training sessions as you can, whether they're NGA ones or those put on by AJ. Again, invaluable. And a lesson learned for me was really know your school, your context, your data, including your financials. It's just really, really important. And something that came up from one of our feedbacks is are we looking after our staff now? Really key. What actions have been done?
Yes. Sorry to interrupt you, Helen. We're just seeing your title slide, and I think the slide that you're talking to flashed up just now and vanished. So we're just seeing your Frogwell School experience slide at the moment.
I can see at my end, so I don't know whether there's a time lag. Has that changed for you?
Not for me, David.
No, I'm still seeing the title.
Okay, they're changing for me, so I do apologise. Anything at all moving?
No, afraid not.
Okay, right. Let me see if I can I unshare?
Yeah, that's good.
I stop share. Oh, it's going to be one of those internet mornings. It was all looking so well when Grant did his.
No, we're just seeing a black screen at the moment. It's saying you've started screen sharing, it's vanished again. Unfortunately, you may need to talk.
Not going to work,
slides.
is it?
No.
I think, Kirsty, it's not going to work. Shall I just continue talking?
Yeah.
You continue talking and then we'll circulate your presentation later, if that's okay.
Yeah, okay. So I do apologise. I'm not in my home location, so one of those things, unfortunately. So I was about to say staff welfare survey is really important. And one of the tips that I'd picked up from one of the recent governor sessions I'd attended is there's a software product out there called Wellbe. So if any schools are doing their own welfare surveys, it might be really a top tip to look at this Wellbe software. So for primary schools, it's around £250,000 a year. And you can use an online survey tool, which means for staff, it's more anonymous, but also there's benchmark data, which could be really, really helpful. Okay, so that really before the inspection is knowing your school, knowing your data. Now we only had, I think it was 2 years between our inspections, and from that 2-year period, we only had about 4 months where we weren't in a COVID environment. So one of the things I think I learned moving forward is I'd been through several Ofsted inspections before, and I've probably gone into those inspections with my ring binders, with my folder, with all my evidence to hand. So when I was asked questions, I was able to say, I know that, I've got that, I've seen that. But actually, it's quite a different environment when you're then doing an inspector's discussion with maybe some of your team on Zoom, some of you in the room. So one of the things that I would sort of give as feedback as well is to try and have everybody in the room, because it's quite difficult if you're trying to address the questions from some people in the room and some people online. So that was a new experience for me. And I think also as well is making sure that you've got the information to hand. I find it more difficult to recall information now because we share so much information on team sites and perhaps don't have it in hard copy. For me, I find it really difficult to remember as much information. So the pre-prep sessions, which Steve actually did with us, are so important. You need to know, what are your targets? What is your school? What are the strengths of your school? What are the key areas you're working on? How do governors evidence the information that comes to them? So for us, we were developing areas of the curriculum. We were asked how we knew about that evidence. Are any of my slides showing at all? No. Okay.
Very nice.
Okay, I asked some of the staff governor views what they thought of the inspection process. They said they thought the process was conducted very efficiently and very fairly. One of our staff governors, she said, I'm going to quote her words, she said, the experience was fine, really glad that the inspectors were interested in early years. They were very nice, they just asked, tell me about, and then the inspector would occasionally ask a question. He came to classroom visits to see that what he'd been told was happening was really happening. And advice for early years was just be confident to talk about early years, you know, just tell the inspectors everything they know. And for us, they didn't particularly do a deep dive into maths because they were happy with the information that had been given. So from the staff governor views, it was just, you know, talk to the inspectors, tell them and be confident with what you know. I asked some of our other governors what their views were, and they thought that our assessors or inspectors were very fair, very measured. They didn't make assumptions. They pushed for clarifications, but it is sometimes that more difficult to think about the answers. Thank you, David. You'll share my slides, are you?
Yes.
Thank you. In the feedback meeting, I'd say I think a note taker would be really helpful. It's quite difficult to try and listen to what the Ofsted inspectors are saying and write all your key messages at the same time. So I think if there's somebody in there that can take notes, that would be really helpful. In some of the cases, some of our feedback could have been a bit helpful if we'd had a little bit more in writing. I say we're trying to listen to the feedback, but different members might interpret it slightly differently. And we know that obviously the head teacher has a feedback session that's separate. So it's just trying to make sure we've all got the key messages that are same, because it's the reports themselves now are quite short to what they were in the past. So the feedback session is absolutely invaluable. So some of the actions. So for us, unfortunately, we did end up in needing support. And as governors, we were classified as needing additional support. David, if you can move on a slide. We are now receiving support from the WGA. So that has been commissioned by AJ and Governor's Services. We've had a lead support worker allocated. So far, she's had introductory calls with Chairhead and Governor's Services. She's observed one of our governing body meetings. She's doing a desktop review of all of our paperwork from our SharePoint site. She's inviting one-to-one sessions with each of the governors. And then we've also, interestingly, been asked back to an NGA session to review what our support has been like. But obviously we're not through that process yet. We're partway through that process. So David, if you move on one for some lessons learned that I would feed back, I'd say no two Ofsted inspections are ever the same. Be careful what you say. This is from me, honesty might not be the best policy. I gave an honest answer that I didn't know something because I couldn't recall the information instantly. Also be aware inspectors might not see things the same way you do. Again, this is just my personal view. I gave a response about something which I thought was the right response, that showed how the governors were investing some funds in supporting one of our clubs, Breakfast Club, to support our vulnerable learners. I couldn't remember it's being funded by pupil premium. So the mistake for me was I should have known that, and I should have done more in advance to actually know the school in greater depth. Try and make sure the right governors answer the questions. So if you've got a couple of governors in the room, I think it's quite important to try and chair the session as to who will respond to give the right answers. I say make sure the staff looked after the feedback notes and really take all the support from the NGA and Wiltshire that you can. I know I said that Steve is here, but I would say, even if Steve wasn't here, that the support there is really, really helpful. And that was the summary of my slides.
That's lovely. Thank you very, very much, Helen. So I'm just going to bring in Cyril now. He hasn't got any slides, but he can talk a little bit about his experience at St Augustine's.
Good morning. Yes, I haven't got any slides. I apologise for that. I happen to be constitutionally allergic to PowerPoint, as I'm amazed, constantly amazed by how the teaching profession, which is after all supposed to be a profession in which you talk to people, actually hides behind PowerPoint slides. Now, forgive me, I'm not criticising, that's just my position, that's my peculiarity. We were inspected in November, we got the report in January. So i.e. we were supposed to keep quiet about it over those 3 months, which was a bit difficult. That's just a sort of a reason why it all has gone a little bit quiet and soft in a way, because it was a big shock for us. St Augustine's secondary school in Trowbridge, just short of 1,000 pupils strong, rated outstanding since 2007, not inspected since then. So we expected to go down to good, frankly, partly because of the new framework, the new way of assessing things, partly because they weren't giving out so many outstanding grades like sweeties. But to go down to RI was a shock, certainly. Part of what we learned from it was that, and this may not be the same for many of you, was that the vast majority of our teaching staff, including the whole of SLT, had never been through an Ofsted inspection before. So although, as Helen says, yes, the training is useful, there is, as she also says, no substitute for actually having the experience of having been through one. We think the result was probably fair, but if you read the report, it just doesn't, to me, add up. That we got requires improvement on all, whatever it is, 5, 6 of the headings, including, for example, sixth form provision requires improvement. The sixth form was not mentioned in any adverse terms in the report. So it's quite clear to me anyway, that what the inspectors were looking at was, first of all, some things they could actually lay their hands on and mention in the report. But secondly, just to get a feel of the school. And that is probably why we got requires improvement across the board, because we're probably more than a touch complacent, which is partly to do with the fact that we hadn't been inspected since 2007. So in the long run, it's probably salutary for the school. It's salutary for the children in the school, the students in the school. But in the short term, it has been a bit of a shock and a bit of, not exactly a feeling of unfairness, but a little sort of moment of puzzlement. Let me tell you what we learned, what we experienced. The first thing that was really quite surprising to me anyway, coming in completely from the outside and not having any idea of how these things go, was that the pre-inspection call with the head was 2 hours long. And it covered a whole raft of things that he was being asked about. We had 3 deep dive subjects. 4, English, PE, science and history were the deep dive subjects. And those all took place on the first day. I'm assuming that most of you will know how the thing is structured. Day 1 and day 2 are quite different. Day 1, they spend most of the time in the classroom observing and talking to the teachers. Day 2, it's the wider spectrum, including business manager and governors and so on. One of the things that we do need to mention is the single central register. Now, about 3 weeks, we were kind of expecting an inspection, but more or less in the way that you're expecting root canal treatment, but haven't made the appointment with the dentist yet. So you know it's coming sometime, but you haven't actually committed to it. So we knew what was coming, and so we did actually have a look at the single central register, which in the last 3 or 4 years was perfect. Deep down, though, we found that it was absolutely not perfect. And since a lot of our teachers have been with us for a long time, that was something that needed to be put right. So please check your single central register is up to date and do it constantly, because I'm afraid in our case, we had some wonderful staff who did an all-nighter before the inspectors arrived to make sure that it was in good order, and indeed it was, but it was a bit of a panic. When the inspectors sat down with the heads of department, they were quite surprisingly insistent on, for example, local context. They wanted to know what the curriculum, how it took account of the local context, and indeed the pupil profile. So those were things that we probably weren't strong enough on. Whether or not, I mean, a lot of this is in the communication of the position. I think one of the remarks that I thought was very accurate was that the head told me that a lot of the teachers, when talking to Ofsted, went into reflective mode. So they said, yeah, well, we do this, but we could have done that, or maybe it'd be a good idea to do the other. That is not the way to handle an inspection. An inspection is, you don't, I think, I mean, I agree with, there's a sort of borderline. Helen said, don't be too honest. I think you have to be honest, because if you're found out, that makes it much worse. But I think you need to, the staff need to be told that what they need to do is defend their position. So what they're doing is the best, I mean, don't, as it were, discuss how it could be improved with the inspectors. Just tell them that it's marvelous. And then the inspectors can make up their mind as to whether or not it is, you know, they agree that it's marvelous. And clearly, one's got to be realistic and not be silly. But at the same time, this is not a moment to have a discussion as to how, you know, things might be different. They are what they are. Yeah, the COVID, we were still hearing from all sorts of quarters, oh, well, it's all because of COVID. Well, that's not what an inspection is. An inspection is what is the quality of the education that the children in the school are getting now. It doesn't really matter how or why they got there, but is it good enough now? And I think that'll be true whether or not COVID is in the background. It's all very well saying, yeah, well, we're planning to do that next year. You know, we'll have a much better curriculum if you came back in a year's time. Well, that's no good to the children who are actually in the school now. And I think that is what an Ofsted inspection is. It's checking up on that question, not on, it really, in a way, the focus is on the students and the quality of service that they are getting, and not on the quality of the teachers or the governors or anything else. They're not asking whether we're good governors and, you know, can see the problems with the school and plan to do something about it next year. They're asking, well, what is the impact now? And that, I think, is quite an important distinction. Data, couldn't care less about the data, which is a bit odd because it's a huge swing in the pendulum from what used to be the case, as I understand it. Our data is quite good, but played no role at all where our exam results were not of interest to the inspectors, which I think is a bit odd, because if your quality of education requires improvement, yet your exam results include, well, our CAGs and tags were consistent with our 2019 and earlier results, and puts us in the top 10% of schools in Wiltshire. So in a sense, to kind of ignore that however badly we're doing our teaching, it seems to turn out with good exam results is a little bit odd. But anyway, that's the way it goes. There was, by contrast, an entirely fair criticism of our failure to really tackle the SEND cohort properly, and they were heavy on that. And it's something that we were already working at, and that make sure that the teachers in each class actually do take account of the number of SEN pupils in their classroom and design the curriculum accordingly. quite a lot of the criticisms were what I call technical, and by that I don't mean that they're insignificant, but that the curriculum wasn't sufficiently well planned, that the sequencing was not correct, that there was the SEND problem, things that were really kind of the inspectors found on day one, and by the end of day one, the quality of education die was cast. We were going to be RI in terms of the quality of education. And that, as I understand it, means that you're likely to go down on all the others as well. So by the time it got to day two, there wasn't really very much we could do. I think the head knew that at the end of day one that we were heading for requires improvement. So we as governors, I'm afraid I can't really help you very much on that because we had a really easy ride. Joe Burkett-Wentz, who's my vice chair, and I decided that we were the only two who could possibly be trusted to speak to the inspectors. So it was just the two of us. And they ran through some pretty standard questions, including, you know, have you had safeguarding training? Answer, yes. Oh, well, that's good then, that's fine. You know, so it wasn't far-reaching because they knew that the issue was the performance of the teaching staff in the classroom and the design of the curriculum further up the tree. Now, that to us as governors told us that we were not getting the right reports back from the front line and that the quality assurance was not up to scratch. And in a way, that's the most important lesson that we as governors learned, was that nobody was telling us lies, but it's just that the information from the front line was inadequate. And that's what we're looking to improve. What we did, the HOD, the heads of departments and the deep dive subjects were asked, the night before, they were asked to make sure that they had their departmental self-evaluations to hand and in their heads. What do we wish we had said to them on top of that? This is not a reflective exercise point. We wish we'd said to them, listen, your job is to present the best possible picture of where we are now. The end of day one, we kind of knew that we were in trouble, and we probably didn't fight back enough on day two. And I don't think that is, again, anything the governors could have done, because we're not in a position to say, look, if you're looking at the English curriculum, you don't think that's appropriately sequenced. Well, have a look at the modern languages curriculum, and you'll find that, you know, if English is a problem, other subjects are not. And I think there was the only area where I think we felt that we weren't quite fairly treated, is that they weren't prepared to look at and listen to other evidence that other than the deep dives that they went into. So we weren't able to counter their impression that the curriculum in 2 of the 4 subjects they looked at the curricula were defective. We weren't able to answer that by saying, look, it's not across the school, this isn't a school-wide problem. So that's fighting back on day 2, or indeed on day 1, is an important part of it. And I think everybody ought to be aware that there's going to be challenge. It's not just neutral questioning. It's not, I think Helen said that they were actually very nice and said, you know, tell us about this and tell us about that. That wasn't our experience. They were right in there, all guns blazing, not unfairly and not in human terms unpleasantly, but they were challenged. They were really looking to unpick what was going on, and the challenge was direct. It wasn't just neutral questioning. So when challenged, if one's going to give the right impression, it's a question of fighting back, not just a question of saying, well, on the one hand this, on the other hand that. I think the note taker, Helen's point about having a note taker at the feedback meeting. Now, for those of you who haven't been through recently, the traditional feedback meeting at the end of the day with lots of people there has gone. what you get is feedback, in our case, to our head and one of the deputy heads, where the detail is explained. Now, when it came to the feedback meeting that we attended, and which all governors were invited to, although not all came, but it was extremely short. It was about as short as the report. So you're not going to get the detail that you need to know from the inverted commas feedback meeting at the end of the very end of the process. The meat of it is given to the head and maybe one or other deputy head in the meeting immediately before that. And at that meeting, it would be extremely helpful to have a note taker. I certainly second that. We actually did get some pretty comprehensive notes from our head and deputy head, but it must have been quite a struggle, both listening and taking notes. Our big failing was in this area of curriculum planning, and we didn't have, we now realize in retrospect, the kind of evidence that we needed of the rationale behind the planning. We need you need to be able to present to the inspectors the reason why the curriculum is structured in this way, how the units interlink, how they build on one another, and so on. Similarly, so far as the SEN and disadvantages are concerned, you need an evidence trail that these students are making progress. We didn't have that, and we're talking both in terms of the curriculum and in terms of personal development. And that's true. Well, so personal development leads on to extracurricular activities. We didn't have evidence of the participation of SEN and disadvantaged students in extracurricular activities, which is clearly would be a plus. At the highest level, and I suppose something that the governors should feel that they need to work on, is that we've got lovely, as I think probably we all have, we've got lovely vision and mission and goodness knows what statements on our website, and we say wonderful things that we're doing and would like to do and so on. But is that actually visible in the classroom? Answer in our case, no. And that was something I do feel that we as governors should have done something about. Probably there wasn't any opportunity to bluff our way on that in the inspection, but that is certainly something that we were criticised for, and where I can see some substance. Those are the things that I made a note of to say. So there you are.
Thank you. Cyril, do you still have to dash off in 4 minutes' time, or do we have you for a little bit longer?
I can probably squeeze 5 minutes out of my programme, but I do need to dash off, I'm afraid.
Okay, so what I'm going to do quickly then is I'd just like to bring in Steve. And Steve, just introduce yourself, and if you've got any thoughts on what you've heard from what they have both said, that would be lovely. And then there are a few questions in the chat which I will raise. Helen's been responding to some of them as we've been going, but there are a couple of others that I will add in. And then if anybody has any questions, please get them ready and stick your hands up, and I'll come to you straight away after that. So Steve, do you just want to introduce yourself in the context in which you're here today, and then just
yeah, of course. I work for the school effectiveness team for Wiltshire Council. Some of you will know me because I'm sometimes at AJ's chair's reference group meeting. I'm also a team inspector for Ofsted. I have to say I am not allowed to speak to you as somebody from Ofsted, but I can speak to you as somebody from the local authority who's got experience of Ofsted. And what I would say, following up from Helen and Cyril, is every inspection is different, because the inspectors will, I don't want to say go down rabbit holes, but if something is mentioned to them that concerns them, they will want to follow it up, which is why they go in different directions, and which is why some governing bodies will get more of a grilling than other governing bodies. But as Cyril was saying, the thing they are focusing most on is the quality and sequencing of the curriculum. So I don't know if you've heard of the 3 I's that Ofsted talk about in the education inspection framework, but it's intent, implementation, and impact. And where governors can help with that is the intent is how do your vision and values for your school influence the curriculum that you feel the children in your school need, and that's where the local context comes in. What are the children like in your school? What do you feel they need to prepare them for the next stage of their education, whether that's secondary education or the world of work or whatever? So that's where you can be involved, is with the intent, and also in the impact. It's challenging school leaders. What is the impact, and how do you know what the impact is? And then make sure that that's minuted. I don't know.
Oh, I think we just lost Steve, or is that my connection gone dodgy? Steve, did you just mute yourself?
We lost him. We lost him.
Yeah, he's muted himself, I think.
He disappeared.
Okay, I don't quite know what happened there. I can still see his name on the screen, but I can see it muted. All right, well, hopefully he'll come back. All right, well, thank you really both Helen and Cyril for being so honest. So a couple of the comments in the questions, and as I've dropped in, if you're not used to Teams, you can click on reactions and raise your hand there. So there was some clarification about the Wellbe funding. Was that 250, Helen, rather than the 250,000 you mentioned, which was slightly scary figure?
Sorry. Yeah, 250 pounds. Can I just sincerely apologise? We tested before the meeting and Zoom was fine, and then literally as I started, it just went poor internet, and I had all my notes, and it completely threw me from everything I'd planned to say. And I'm afraid I didn't say half. Probably for your benefit, I didn't say half of what I was going to say. So that's probably less is more on this occasion.
Okay, so I'm going to ask a quick financial question about a couple of general questions, and then Helen, if you have anything you want to come back in with, then do that. But I just want to try and capture some things before Cyril disappears. So the first one, which was quite specific from Margaret, is: do you have a teacher on your governing body, Cyril, other than the head teacher?
We have 3 with teaching experience. All 3 really are retired.
That's interesting, because I'm surprised they haven't challenged the this issue about curriculum more then.
Well, I mean, if you're talking about pre the inspection, 2 of them have joined fairly recently, yeah, it's a question, I suppose, of the degree to which you or we as governors are obliged to delve into operational matters such as the planning of individual subject curricula. So yeah, I mean, it would have been nice, wouldn't it, if we'd been able to say you've got your history curriculum in the wrong order or whatever, but I'm not sure that's part of our job.
Well, I think it possibly is, actually, because you presumably you have a curriculum subcommittee.
Oh yes, yeah.
But that's their job. Not the whole governing body, but the curriculum subcommittee.
This feels like a much more intense Ofsted inspection.
Yes, exactly. But I think it is the curriculum subcommittee's job to be looking at stuff like that. And
we'll give it a go.
Yeah, I think that's but yeah,
okay.
I hope you've got your ex-teachers on your curriculum subcommittee. I suppose that's what I'm trying to say.
All right.
Thank you. Another quick question, which was from Michaela. Again, Cyril, since you're in vision at the moment on my screen, we'll go to you first and then to Helen. What type of financial questions did Ofsted ask the Chair of Finance?
Well, I was just putting it in the chat, nothing. We didn't present the Chair of Finance. Our finances are in good order. We have monthly management accounts, which I'm imagining they may have looked at with the business manager. But no concerns on that front at all.
Okay, thank you. And then Helen just added a couple of other things about having local context and embedded curriculum. So that's useful to know that came up at both of those. Helen, did you have any specific finance questions to you?
Well, that's the one where I say I take a sort of personal failure at, really. I didn't know a level of detail in a budget line. We had a fairly new chair of that subcommittee, was fairly new to governors. And that's where my learning was. If I'd had some of the good old paper sheets in front of me, I might have been able to answer the question, but I couldn't answer the question about a particular budget line, which for me, I was, highly embarrassed about, because how many chairs would know particular budget lines, individual fundings? But that came out of a...
That sounds to me like a complete waste of time, because it's like a kind of driving test question, isn't it? What do you do in approach a zebra crossing? Well, no.
Yeah, and so for me, that's why I said honesty was maybe not the boss policy. I said to the inspector, I'm sorry, I don't know that level of detail. I don't attend that subcommittee. And I think that was slightly frowned upon, but that's, I'm being honest. I didn't know, rather than try and bluff my way out of it. I didn't have a bit of paper. I couldn't remember on the spot. It was one of those things, really. But it came out of the question, really, that I was going to relay earlier is, how well do you know your school? And I'm trying to remember questions that Steve will have said to me. Know the context of your school, know your school's strengths, know your school inside and out, really, for its key data. And that is one of the questions they asked us. What are the strengths of your school? What do you know about your school? And that was one of the big openers. And I think it's a really good question from an Ofsted inspector, because when you answer that, you answer it, and that gives them the choice of the different questioning sets they can go down. So I'm chair of governors, but I didn't ever attend the finance subcommittee. So that's why I had a knowledge and skills gap.
Kirsty,
Steve,
I'm afraid I now have to go. I'm so sorry, but thank you very much for organising this.
I just want to say thank you to you and Helen both for your extreme honesty in both your presentations. So we'll let you disappear, but we'll carry on asking questions, letting other people ask questions. But thank you very much, Cyril. Mark,
Kirsty, I am back in the room.
Okay, that's great, Steve. I'll just let Mark ask his question quickly, and then we'll come back to you again, Steve.
Yeah, I'm actually concerned about that pupil premium finance question, because I chair our finances, or the committee looks after finances, and I've got an extremely detailed spreadsheet that has everything in far more detail than probably the average governor. And I wouldn't be able to answer that question. I don't think governors should be able to answer that question. It feels like that's a school sort of level of detail. But my basic question was, how much are the governors that are rolled out in front of the inspector supposed to know everything? Because I said I'm not on our curriculum standards one, so I know some very basic stuff about our curriculum, what's doing, but I leave that up to our curriculum and standards chair and committee to deal with. So are all governors supposed to have lots of detailed knowledge about lots of things, or just the bits they're responsible for?
I'm going to have a go at answering that question in terms of what we did when we were last Ofsteded, and that was that we took in the key governors for their key subject areas, so that we had half a dozen or more in the room, so that we could bounce around. So not every governor had to know everything, but you'd expect the SEN governor to be able to answer those questions, for example. But Steve is back with us, and so he might have a view on that as well.
I am. I've no idea how long I was talking and how much you heard before. I could have been talking to myself for a couple of minutes. What I suggest to governors is you have a plan A and a plan B, because obviously Ofsted turn up when they turn up. They give you 24 hours notice, and as governors, with other lives, let's face it, you may not be available at such short notice. So you have a plan A, and make sure you've got governors from each committee, and a plan B, and make sure you've got governors from each committee, because you're not all expected to know everything.
But they'd expect the details to be clearly evidenced anyway. On the site,
my feeling is at the moment is an Ofsted administrator will trawl through the website pre-inspection and flag up anything for the inspectors. So make sure all your statutory stuff's on there, and then I would go over and above with the curriculum information, because the more information you can provide inspectors with before they get there, the more questions they'll have answered. So the fewer questions they'll need to ask. So
it's more a question of it being, but it would be better to have it just clearly signposted, so that anyone can find the information rather than having something that seems to be just there for the inspector.
Yes, don't have a follow this lead inspector, but just have a really clear and simple to use website.
Okay, that's great. Now, we've lost Cyril obviously, but does anybody have any other questions for Helen? She's popped a few other little bits in the chat. Or Helen, would you like to fill in the gaps that you weren't able to say earlier while we're waiting for some questions?
I'd say something where Cyril said their feedback session wasn't very detailed. Steve was at ours, and I'd say we had a very thorough feedback session with plenty of detail. So I'm quite surprised for Cyril to say the feedback session wasn't detailed and wasn't long, because ours was good. There was a really good level of detail, and that's why I said the note taker, because you're trying to listen, absorb and write it, which we know sometimes you don't always get the nuances. So certainly for us, it was the embedded curriculum. So where we'd had phonics and maths, I think from my previous inspection, this time we were embedding a new curriculum. You can get information, you can do your anonymous surveys, you can add some of your own questions, but what's quite good is it can be benchmarked. And so, you know, for most of us that work in large organisations, staff welfare is high on the agenda for most organisations now, and perhaps we've not brought that into the school arena in quite the same way.
To answer your question, Michaela, or did you have anything else that you wanted to ask?
I mean, Steve,
No.
Can you think of anything in our context that I've missed? The LA helped us in advance to do a safeguarding audit.
Yeah, we did an evaluation last.
It's difficult to give feedback so far. So we've got a lady called Ruth. We've done the one-to-one honesty. This is where we are. This is where we think we might need support. So she's doing the desktop paperwork review. What we've not had is the one-to-one interviews with the governors to be able to give the feedback and then come back and do, this is what we think we need as an action plan. So we're not that far through. But I mean, at the moment, Steve, I think I'm down to 4 governors. So part of our problem is we do have a small amount of governors, and that means that workloads are heavy on a few people then.
Yeah, that's quite tough.
Yeah, and I think I've got one falling away during the process as well. And then I had my curriculum governor who for personal reasons had to resign like a week after Ofsted. So it's always this bandwagon, I think, now of trying to get people on, upskill them, and then be able to sustain them.
If anybody knows of anyone else who would like to join a school to govern in Chippenham, just let Helen know, because she would welcome some other governors from the sounds of it. Okay, well, so the diocese is saying that they can't, I don't know, Michaela, can you come on and just talk about that, about the diocese? Michaela, far away, you're unmuted, I can see, but I can't hear you. I wonder if there's an issue, a sound issue with your computer. So yeah, so Michaela's saying—
I can talk about this, Kirsty.
Okay, yeah, far away then, Margaret.
So the diocese, when they set up their own MAT, invented a rule saying that no governor could serve for more than 12 years. They have now decided that this is going to be a universal role for every school in the diocese, whether they're in their MAT or not. Now, we are thinking of challenging them legally about this because it actually goes against our articles of association as an academy, because our articles of association as academy do not include this rule. So recently, one of our most valuable governors was refused to allow her to go on being a governor because she had already served 12 years. She's was a foundation governor. So we then promptly co-opted her, Michaela. So that's what I suggest you do. Don't lose them, co-opt them. she was our Sen governor, and she's our Sen governor, and she's absolutely wonderful governor, and we weren't going to lose her for anything. And had I not had other issues to deal with at the time, I would have gone straight to law about this, and I'm still thinking I'm going to go to law over this. Also, the diocese refuses to allow our vicar to be a permanent member of our governors, even though our articles of association say that he is. They say he also falls under this 12-year rule, which is ridiculous. So we would not have a member of the clergy on our governing body after 12 years, even if the vicar was still in post. How about that? This is all due to the diocese deciding they would invent a rule for their own mat and apply it to every other school in the diocese.
That is extraordinary. I don't know what to say.
I think my school is going to have to challenge them legally on this, because it's made me so angry. I've had long email conversations with Dan Roberts at Salisbury Diocese about this, and I think they have really put their foot in it. And so this is what Michaela's talking about. So Michaela, I'm sorry, you can't, unless you join with me and we do a joint legal challenge about this, which you're very welcome to do. I think they are being very, very foolish. With one hand, they're saying you can't recruit governors, and with the other, they're saying this governor can't serve anyone. They say, oh, well, they can go and be a governor in another school. Well, I'm sorry, but people have loyalty to schools. They don't want to be a governor in another school. They want to be a governor in the school they've always been in. They don't want to go off. They say, oh, well, you know, it's not good for a school to keep on having the same governors, because they get too friendly with the head and they don't challenge the head anymore, and all this sort of thing, which is not true in our case, and I don't think it's true in many cases. I think that's the reasoning behind it. They get too cozy and then they don't challenge anymore. That's their thinking. Well, I don't see what 12 years or 16 years has got to do with that. You can get cozy with somebody in 2 years, can't you? I think it's rubbish. I'm very, very cross about it. I'm sorry.
No, you're right. I can sense that. So did Margaret. Michaela is saying in the chat her sound's not working, but she'd be happy to pick up with you after. So Michaela, why don't you?
Oh, she's a broad shot. Oh, right. Oh, well, there we are. Okay, Michaela, I'll put my email in the
chat, yeah,
in the chat, and then we can get in touch with each other, and maybe, because that's another school very close to us, and maybe, and we're both very good schools, so maybe they would listen to the pair of us. Who knows?
Okay. Well done, thank you. So there's a hand up. Mark, hello.
Is that just the Salisbury Diocese thing, or was that because you mentioned Salisbury? I mean, we're a Church of England school. We're in Bristol. I mean, I have my own views.
It's a Salisbury thing, as far as I know.
Right. Okay. So it wouldn't affect us anyway. Not that we have that issue with our foundation governors, but we do have our local authority governors been one for 20 years. You know, and he's one. Precisely.
It's not fair, is it? Why should foundation governors be affected by this, but not the governors of maintained schools?
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. So unless there's anything else, I just want to say thank you to everyone who's taken part and contributed today. To Steve for attending, to Cyril who's disappeared, obviously, to Helen for her presentation in its various forms, and we'll circulate the PowerPoint as well later. Please don't apologise at all. It did work perfectly well before we started, and then it stopped. So that's all absolutely fine. We haven't had any suggestions for future meetings, but my email is higher up in the chat, but it's chair@wilts-govs.org.uk. So message me or David. Most of you'll have David's email, I'm sure, because he does absolutely everything everywhere. And we'll come up with an agenda for the 9th of July, and it'd be lovely if you could come. And we'll also try to canvass opinions on whether Saturday sessions work for people. I mean, one of the reasons for doing it was when we can meet face to face, it's a really good networking opportunity, but I'm aware people also value their weekends. So if you have any thoughts on that, let us know. Also the evening meetings, would you prefer evenings? Would you prefer weekends? Just feel free to contribute any thoughts and comments to us on that, and we'll take that forward. But unless anyone's got anything else they want to say, stick your hand up quickly if you do, if there's something we haven't covered or something completely off the wall. And if not, I'll draw it to a close. Okay, no one's fast off the draw there. So I'm going to draw it to a close. So thank you very much, and hopefully you'll see you in July. Take care.